This past Easter, my wife and I were getting ready to drive to meet my family for lunch. It was about a 25-minute drive each way, so as she was getting ready, I was browsing Spotify and YouTube for something to listen to. I came across a newer video by the Epic Nate 315 about the ongoing Dunwich mystery in the Fallout franchise. As soon as we started driving, and I put it on, my wife rolled her eyes and asked, "Can we listen to anything else?" This brief exchange was something that I've seen over and over again at D&D tables. A GM gets really excited about some kind of intricate lore they want to introduce to their players. And as they prattle on and on about all the details, the players inside their minds are trying to mentally hit a skip button to get to the action. So why is there this huge gap between those of us that can't get enough lore and those of us that roll our eyes as soon as they hear the word? Hi, I'm John. This is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming. And today we're going to discuss some strategies to help your players fall in love with lore. Let's get into it. Before we tumble too far down the rabbit hole, I think that it'll be valuable to start by getting on the same page about what we mean when we use the term lore. For our purposes, in a TTRPG context, lore refers to information that establishes the game's setting, whether that be the game's fictional history or some kind of explanation to a fictional element like the use of magic or sci-fi technology. For example, in D&D, the lore of magic is that there's this weave that permeates the multiverse that spellcasters draw on to create magical effects. Whereas in Star Wars, Force users generate their quote-unquote magical powers through microorganisms called midichlorians. While researching this topic, one note I found online that I found particularly insightful is that lore is passive, whereas story is active. Oftentimes, lore is about something that's already happened, or some static element of the world, like how magic works, whereas story is about how characters change or progress. I can see how the two of them can get confused, and why GMs may accidentally over-prioritize lore rather than their game's story. In my experiences as a GM and player, I find that almost universally, players love the story of TTRPGs. However, they get a bit more polarized when it comes to the lore. So why is lore such a polarizing topic? Let's start from the side of the argument from those of us that love lore. From my perspective, I think those of us compelled by lore like it because it deepens our appreciation of something else that we love or have a fond relationship with. Part of why my wife rolled her eyes at a video on the Dunwich mystery is because she doesn't care about Fallout. If instead I had popped on a video about the deep lore of Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, I'm sure she might have had a different reaction. The thing about lore, too, is that while it can sometimes serve a function in a story, a lot of the times it's more of an optional element. Let's take the Dunwich mystery in Fallout as an example. In Fallout, through the course of the main story, you do learn about the lore of the world. The fall of the Minutemen, the establishment of Diamond City, what the Institute is up to. All of those are elements of the game's lore. But you can also choose to skip the documents or terminal entries that establish a lot of this background, and instead focus on the story of maybe the Minutemen's rise to power again, or the Institute's escalating attempts to recall synths. However, when we're discussing deep lore, it often changes our entire perspective of what our experience is with a piece of media. The Dunwich mystery is about a supernatural element in Fallout, which isn't often discussed outright, but the further we investigate some of the clues left for us, the more we may find that even the entire inciting event of the franchise, the titular nuclear fallout, may have been a result of some supernatural being that's only mentioned offhand. And as we revisit the game, we pay attention to some of the clues a little differently, which allows us to relive a lot of the experiences in a new light. Again, it allows us to deepen our appreciation of something we already love. That being said, if that love isn't created in the first place, then there's nothing to deepen. The more I play TTRPGs, the more I find that players who quote-unquote hate lore don't really hate lore as much as its delivery. They get bored of lore drops or lore exposition because it's not presented in a fun, digestible way. Players like this, my wife included, develop a kind of emotional flinch at the term lore because she's connecting it to an experience of having to sit to a GM, draw on and on and on about these little details she doesn't care about. For GMs listening to this, I see you and I hear you. Yes, I understand how compelled you are by your own lore and the love that you've put in creating it. However, just because you love it doesn't mean your players are automatically going to. How you present it and how much of it you present is going to directly impact whether or not they're going to be able to connect to it. So, with this in mind, what are some strategies that we can use when delivering our lore so that our players are more likely to be excited or at the very least intrigued by it? A few years ago, I played a game session with a GM that presented some alternative lore regarding giants in their custom D&D setting. They had revealed giants to be these interdimensional peacekeepers that only were summoned when there was some big supernatural threat. Which, of course, those of you who are familiar with D&D lore surrounding giants is a huge departure of their usual depiction. After the game, when all the other players had left, the GM asked me, "What did you think of it?" And really all I could think to say was, it was neat. I could tell this GM was disappointed by my answer. The sense I got was they wanted me to tell them how much my expectations were subverted, or how creative an idea that was. What I explained to them is that the disconnect for me is that while that was a neat idea, it wasn't relevant to the quest that our characters were on, and there was nothing we could do with it. From my memory, the way it was presented was that we were in a dungeon and we found some kind of carving with some giant language that explained this random lore about giants, but it was just set decoration in a larger dungeon, and we didn't have like a giant ally NPC, or we weren't fighting giants or anything. So again, it was a neat little drop, but it didn't connect at all because it was just a random detail. And we didn't end up playing in that setting again afterwards. This is one of the most common pitfalls I see GMs that are excited about lore fall into. They don't present lore that's relevant to what the players are doing. They may be really excited about storytelling potential or how different that idea is from what players might expect. But again, if the players can't do anything with it, they're just less likely to care. Now, in discussions like this, sometimes what GMs will tell me is, well, it's part of the world building. It's building the world out for the players. And here's my hot take for the day. I think a lot of GMs over-prioritize world building to the point that it's actually detrimental to how they run their games. They get so large scope in their view of what's going on in the world and all the intricate political dynamics. They forget what their players are experiencing now and whether or not they're feeling accomplished session to session. I actually have an example of how relevant lore was used really well in a session I was a part of. I was recently part of a session run by Ian from Incendium RPGs, and in his custom world, the healing faction has these lanterns, which are magic items that help novice healers be able to treat the wounded in a village or settlement. The conflict of this session is that the lantern was stolen in a robbery, and one of our ally NPCs was hurt, So without the lantern, there's a good chance that he would die. Ian presented some lore about this lantern, including the fact that they are limited in number, the secrets to how they're constructed have been lost to time, and a lot of people don't really know how they work. So with this lore in mind, it helped establish the stakes for the session. If we don't recover the lantern, it's unlikely our NPC ally is going to live the night. This was a lore detail, and it was incredibly relevant to our character's emotional connection to the story, and actually fueled a lot of the dialogue that we eventually had with the lantern's robber. It's a great example of how including relevant lore made the story we told together richer and the experience more enjoyable. Of course, no matter how relevant your lore is, if you're presenting too much too fast, your players are likely going to either be confused or bored by it. When I see players get bored of lore, it's either because there's either too much or the GM is being inefficient with how they're delivering it. You know, the talent of some people to squeeze one sentence of conversation into 5 minutes. To go back to the example I just used about Ian's game with the lantern, one of the reasons why it was such an enjoyable, usable piece of lore was that there wasn't too much lore we had to remember. There were a few key details that we were very clear on, and that allowed us to be able to integrate it into dialogue we had with our characters. If instead he'd gone on and on about the history of the healing faction and the meaning of every rune intricately carved on the lanterns outside, well, that might have been boring, and eventually we would have rolled our eyes too. That being said, I distinctly remember a session like this. 30 sessions in, we'd built this huge story arc where our player characters were constantly at odds with this overarching big bad. After 29 sessions of buildup, we finally get to the boss's lair, a ruined city that was lost to time. Lost to time is a big theme in today's video. We had about an hour to play. We start by stepping foot into the city. The GM describes the intricate terrain, the Doric columns, and all the carvings and marble statues. After they ask, "What would you like to do?" our player characters say, "We proceed to find the boss." To which the GM then described another intricate scene of a spiral staircase. To which our character said, "We follow the staircase to find the boss." This loop continued for the full hour, and the session ended with us finally getting to the outside of the boss's chamber. It was an entire hour of scene description, with our characters not making any choices but to just try to find the boss to fight them. It's a hallmark example of trying to deliver too much lore to the point that I don't even remember why we were at this city or what happened in it. Just that there was a lot. So to recap so far, you want to keep your lore relevant and digestible, and if you want your players engaged with it, you gotta keep some of the puzzle pieces to yourself. To go back to Nate's video on the Dunwich mystery, the reason that this mystery is so compelling is we actually don't have all of the puzzle pieces. That's what makes it a mystery. Every few months or so, he uploads a new video with new content that's been added to Fallout 76, or released in some other product like the Fallout TTRPG. These little clues are dispersed in these various media for the players or audience to put together like puzzle pieces. In my latest campaign, one of the things I actually decided to prioritize was lore, but I very intentionally gave only enough clues to keep my players interested and asking questions, while being very careful not to give so much away that the mystery was solved too early. Now, just because I didn't answer every question doesn't mean I didn't answer any questions. There's an art form to relaying enough information to keep your players hooked, rather than being so withholding they give up asking questions altogether. The other little thing about not giving away too much lore too quickly, is as your players start to come up with some, quote unquote fan theories, you might be like, it's actually a really good idea and better than what I came up with. Your players, if they get a sense that they're intimately involved with the creation of ongoing lore, will start to take ownership of their game more and more. Even my wife, who usually hates lore, is part of this campaign and asking me lore questions quite often. And the thing I attribute to it is that it's relevant, digestible, and there are questions for her to ask, some of which will be answered in the next session, but not all of them. So now I want to hear what you have to say. Are you one of us that absolutely love lore, or do you roll your eyes at the word? Is there a game you remember fondly where lore was an integral part of the experience? Let me know in the comments down below. Hit like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. And remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.